Buckeyes Now on Sports Illustrated continues our live coverage of the Ohio State Buckeyes. And we've got a recruiting update for you because today's a big day in Columbus. The Ohio State Buckeyes have landed their very first recruit for the class of 2023. And Andrew Lind here with me to break it down. Andrew, Ty Lockwood, a tight end from 2023. Probably not the position that most people would expect to have that first commitment or your first pledge for the class. But it certainly seems like it's been a trend lately for tight ends. What can you tell us about Ty Lockwood and his commitment to the Buckeyes?
For sure. As you mentioned, you don't expect a tight end, especially from out of state, to be the first person to commit. But it was kind of getting to that point where people were asking whether Ohio State was ever going to get a commitment for the class of 2023, just because there's other schools. Oklahoma is up, reaching double digits almost at this point for their class. So Ohio State's fallen behind in that aspect. Lockwood was on campus twice in this summer, and once in June and once in July. And it's kind of one of those things where it felt right. There's no reason to wait something that you felt was eventually going to happen anyway.
How about this current tight end room and how Lockwood could fit into it? Jeremy Ruckert obviously is going to be done at the end of this season. You've got a bunch of other really athletic, good players that are all converted tight ends. Perhaps Lockwood could be a more natural fit at tight end. Is he the kind of guy that you think could make a splash right away once he gets here? Absolutely. And you mentioned that Ruckert is obviously going to be gone after this year. You'll have G. Scott, you'll have Joe Royer, and Cade Stover coming up, but they'll be upperclassmen by the time that Lockwood arrives on campus 2 years from now. So it's really not one of those things where you can look at the current depth chart and say that it's going to really impact him in any way. Obviously, I mentioned in his impact article today that he's very similar to Ruckert in that he's a pass catching tight end who's going to need to learn how to block a bit. But if there's somebody who you want to target your tight end commits after, it's definitely Ruckert. Obviously, tight end not necessarily the position that you'd expect, but perhaps the kind of position you would expect to start a class might be a guy like a big running back. Let's talk Richard Young for a second. One of the most highly sought after running backs in the country for the class of 2023. Obviously, Ohio State's pretty high on him. What's the latest there?
Yeah, and we'll kind of talk about several players who have made their way to campus several times throughout the summer. And it's obviously a trend once you see kids make those trips on their own, especially because they're paying their own way at this point. It's not like they're taking official visits. They're coming out for camps. They're coming back to see, be more around the program. Richard Young was also at the Buckeye Bash and Barbecue alongside Lockwood in late July. So it's kind of one of those things you'd like to see somebody like him be the first, commit in the class, but at the same time, they're in a great position with him so far.
Richard Young certainly would be potentially walking into a running back room where, Travion Henderson and Evan Pryor would then be upperclassmen. Again, 2023 feels like an awfully long way from now, but it will be here before you know it. And that class is going to start becoming pretty relevant pretty soon. It wasn't that long ago that Jack Sawyer was the first commit for the class of 2021. And obviously, turned into a heck of a class for the Buckeyes. How about the wide receiver targets in that class? I know in particular Carnell Tate, a guy the Buckeyes are high on.
Yeah, Tate is definitely up there alongside Zachariah Branch, who is Zion Branch, the safety from the current recruiting cycle's younger brother, as well as Braylon James, who is actually at the same high school and I have to be very clear with how I say this, because Caleb Burton is now at Garrett Wilson's old high school, and Braylon James is at Caleb Burton's old high school. So, the Buckeyes do have some history down in Texas with wide receivers, and he, could very well be the next person in line for that.
How about elsewhere in the class of 2023? Just maybe a 10,000-foot view of, guys that Buckeye fans should start to become familiar with their names. You've only got one pledge. You've got a bunch of guys that are certainly interested in the Buckeyes, but the kinds of players that you think maybe Ohio State fans should be interested in following.
Well, we're going to mention the running back position too. Alongside with Young, they're looking at Justice Hayes, who is from Georgia. They're going to look to take two running backs in that cycle. after only taking Dallin Hayden in the current recruiting cycle. So he's definitely somebody who's shown early interest in the Buckeyes. And, if they're going to get 2 running backs, that would be a great group to have. Obviously, Sonny Styles here in Pickerington, just outside of Columbus, would be, a massive get. And if they don't get him, it's a massive miss. It's just kind of one of those things that you have to have. He would have been another person who would have been ideal to have been that first commit.
Class of 2023 off to a good start. Let's look at the class of 2022 right now, and perhaps a little quiet recently because of the NCAA dead period. Obviously, it was a crazy surge of guys trying to get on campus once the extremely long dead period was lifted over the summer. And now with a focus toward high school football starting here and really this week in Ohio and certainly around the country, if not this week, then very soon. September 1st is a big date for the class of 2022. What's the latest there?
Yeah, you mentioned the dead period, and there was a very big rush going into the evaluation period in June, where they were allowed to come on campus, make visits, participate in camps and those kind of things. And that's when we saw, these kids jumping on because they were excited to be a part of a class, finally be on campus. But then there was other kids who kind of took that as an opportunity to say, hey, I need to slow this down a little bit. I need to continue to take visits. And that's kind of where Ohio State is at this point with the rest of its class. Defensive tackle, defensive end is a very big position of need at the moment. So they're going to be waiting until, October, November, December to fill out the rest of the class.
Jaheim Singletary was obviously the big headline grab outside of Quinn Ewers and his situation for the class of 2022. Singletary's timing of his decision probably has a lot of fans wondering, what's going to happen with him because he essentially reopened his commitment and then the dead period started. So he hasn't had a chance to take official visits since then. Do you have any sort of inkling on whether or not the Buckeyes are still right in the mix to land his services?
Yeah, we had mentioned it, in our video at the time when he reopened his recruitment, that Ohio State was definitely still in it. Kind of one of those things where, he wasn't necessarily feeling the culture, wasn't necessarily meshing with the other recruits. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that he's only been on campus one time. He committed. Well, he's only been on campus with the coaches during, an evaluation period, being able to be around the fellow commits one time. He did make a trip on his own shortly after he committed, but the dead period prevented him from seeing the facilities, anything like that. So it's really a matter of getting him back on campus. But the struggle with that is the fact that he doesn't have an official visit remaining, so he's going to have to pay his own way to come back. And if he's not sincere, like in his interest, he's not going to do that.
Yeah, makes total sense. Obviously, there's a lot of skill position guys in the class of 22 that have verbally committed to the Buckeyes, but it looks like Ohio State in that recruiting class still has some things to work on both sides of the football, offensive and defensive line. Any particular names that have your attention right now as you look at the offensive linemen and defensive linemen going into their senior years?
Particularly along the defensive line, you have several defensive ends. There's Anai White, there's Shamar Stewart. Those are guys who visited in June, and they're national recruits that if you get them, like, they're going to be the next, great thing in the long line of great players to come through and play for Larry Johnson. And then, at defensive tackle, there's Hero Canoe, who is from Germany originally, currently plays in California. There's Caden Curry, Chris McClellan from Oklahoma. These are all players that every team in the country wants. So it's going to take a while before we see any movement.
We'll find out how the Buckeyes continue to pound the recruiting trail. They are certainly happy with the group they've got in Columbus right now and are looking forward toward building a future that would continue to put them right there with the best teams in America. Andrew does such a great job covering all things recruiting for Ohio State. Check out his latest work, BuckeyesNow.com. You can find him on social media as well, including today's big announcement that Ty Lockwood is the first pledge for the class of 2023. Andrew, thanks.